Okay, I think the question on everyone's mind after the end of Game of Thrones going into this new series, House of the Dragon, is it good? Is it worth my time? Is it worth to check it out after those last few seasons, but especially in particular, Season 8 of Game of Thrones? This franchise in general has a lot to prove to win back the trust of fans alike, because a lot of people didn't like the end of Game of Thrones. Spoiler alert, they really ain't like the end because of some choices that was made. And yeah, if you see my video right here, I spoke about in vivid detail what those problems were, but essentially the finale made a lot of people sour to the franchise, and despite that fact, HBO decided to make a new one, so to speak, adapting more of George R. Martin's novels into live-action adaptations, this time with, again, House of the Dragon, which is a spin-off prequel to the Game of Thrones series, A Song of Ice and Fire. This one in particular goes back about 200 years roughly, give or take a few years, before the current series of Game of Thrones. And off-rip, one of the things that I feel shines through and through for House of the Dragon is the fact that George R. Martin, because if you've watched Game of Thrones, you can kind of tell that his world building is unlike any other series, because despite the fact that this is 200 years prior to Game of Thrones, and none of those characters, of course, could be alive, minus one. There is one character that's in Game of Thrones that is actually in this series. We'll get into that in a little bit. But essentially, the world building is so profound and so great and rich that when you're hearing about House Lannister, when you're hearing about House Stark, when you're hearing about the Targaryens, when you're hearing about King's Landing, all of these references, despite them being places and houses or whatnot, it feels so familiar, and you really feel like, oh wow, this is great. Again, this is 200 years before the series begins of Game of Thrones, but it still has so many elements that you almost feel like, yeah, I understand this is a prequel. Yeah, this takes place way before the birth of all of my favorite characters, but man, it feels like Game of Thrones to a certain degree with all of these elements, and it truly feels like what you would expect and what would you feel from a prequel. But granted, because you know how Game of Thrones starts, it's pretty much the aftermath following the events of what happened with the Mad King, pretty much the final ruler of the Targaryens, of course, all the way up until we get, you know, the rise, so to speak, of Daenerys Targaryen. And this series takes place primarily during the rule and the reign of the Targaryen Empire. You're getting more of this clan, this house, so to speak, that you really didn't get to explore much, because throughout the series, you only had, well, technically, I guess, 3 Targaryens, but in particular, mainly there was just Daenerys. Like, we had her brother for a little bit, Viserys, but he was just like some weirdo that ended up getting dusted off in the end, and he was not really much. So we really only had Daenerys throughout majority of the series. This series, however, really dives into the past of the Targaryen Empire and kind of give you an inkling of why they fell, so to speak. Because during the reign of this king, again, Viserys, which you could see throughout the series that they love to pass on names. There's like already 2 or 3 different characters named Aegon because of the conqueror Aegon that from the Targaryens or whatnot. Like, they love to pass down names, but essentially King Viserys, he has his kingdom, and ultimately he has his family, but he's very much so vying for, he wants a son to pass on his throne, so to speak. You know, you need that firstborn son in order to continue your reign. Other than that, pretty much then it either has to go to a brother, you know, a sibling of sorts, or your daughter, because Viserys has his daughter, Rhaenyra, and she is a very different type of girl. She's more so, at the very least in the beginning of the series, she kind of sort of reminded me a little bit of Arya Stark, that she's like, I don't want to be a lady. I don't want to, you know, marry into a castle or whatever. She's essentially somewhat of a rebel. You could argue give or take with or without a cause or whatnot, but there's quickly a fine line between her and Arya Stark, because, yeah, this little girl is a little bit too wild for my taste. Because then you also have, alongside the King Viserys, his brother, the Prince Daemon, and rightfully so, because Viserys doesn't have a son, and tragedy befalls the king fairly quickly, that pretty much he won't have a son. Essentially, Daemon would be the ideal to inherit the throne. However, Daemon is a hothead. Daemon Targaryen is pretty much somebody that you want anywhere except in the throne. So much so that throughout the beginning of the series, and even before the series began, he had placed Daemon in different parts of the court, like, hey, you could be the city watch, you could be over here, you could be over there, because he knew his brother is too freaking wild. child. He's exactly what Daenerys and the Mad King pretty much were in their infant stages of, yeah, dog, like he's ready to really just destroy everything. Like he has one opportunity to be with the City Watch and he starts just maiming and destroying people, commoners and whatnot. Like this dude's a nut job. But again, remember, Rhaenyra is not like the average girl. Like she looks at that like, yo, dog, like she wants to be one of the fellas, so to speak. She even has like her childhood best friend that is pretty much a integral part to the story, because later on that childhood best friend ends up hooking up with the king. But that was more so manipulation from her father. Anywho, one thing leads to another where Viserys names Rhaenyra his heir to the throne, and because of tradition and custom, and essentially it's a man's world, most people don't really like that idea. However, a bunch of houses swear loyalty to Rhaenyra as the next heir to the throne, and the story continues on. Because again, that childhood best friend that ends up being with the king eventually becomes queen, and thus begins a rift with Rhaenyra and her friend, her childhood friend, essentially creating the opposing sides of where this story is gonna go. I think it would also help for people to know that the queen's name is Alicent. Yeah, Rhaenyra's friend, childhood friend, and the queen is Alicent. And as time is going by, pretty much Alicent is able to bear some children for Viserys, including that son that he always wanted. However, because he already made peace with this idea that Rhaenyra is going to be the heir to his throne, he's not hearing hide or nothing of these kids being the heir. It's Rhaenyra and that's it, despite Alicent and her father, who is at one point the hand, then not the hand, then the hand again to the king. Essentially, it doesn't matter, I'm sticking with my daughter. And I want to start talking about the king, because despite the fact that you could throw the argument that the king is somewhat of a buffoon, he's only really a buffoon when it comes to two things. One, keeping the peace. He will make some, you could argue, irrational decisions or poor decisions to create peace. But two, when it comes to his daughter. And I ain't even gonna lie, I could understand and sympathize to a certain degree with what King Viserys was going through throughout the series, and there was times where I ain't gonna lie, I flat out felt very extremely sorry for him, because throughout the entire series you're seeing that he is suffering from some sort of disease that is destroying his body. Little by little, it starts off with just like patches cut from his back, to eventually by the end of his life, dude is losing his eyeball, half of his cheek, like he is falling apart. But no matter what, through and through, he still wants to keep to his daughter and his love for his daughter, so much so that despite the fact that Rhaenyra, as she's growing older, is doing a lot of really messed up things, and we're going to talk about some of the messed up things in this series that makes me but nevertheless, even if King Viserys sees something with his own two eyes that he clearly knows his daughter has done wrong, he will blindly accept the falsehood that his daughter has brought forth because he loves his daughter so much. And as a father, I could understand and sympathize, and to a certain degree, I totally get it. Like, dog, that's my kid, I love her to death. But at the same time, one of the things is that Viserys didn't really take his kinghood and him being a king as important, and didn't take that into consideration more so than his duty as a father. I think Viserys, he was a good man, he was a good father, he wasn't the best king in the world, because he just wanted so much so for peace to happen that he would continue allowing for Daemon to be around. Like, Daemon should have died very early on. If Viserys would have killed Daemon, a lot of things that transpired afterward wouldn't have come to pass, because let's start getting down to the brass tacks of some of the problems with this series. And I know there's gonna be some people that are gonna say, yo, but you gotta understand time and place. Back in these days, this was acceptable. All fine and dandy. I totally get that. It's not going to change the fact that it was very uncomfortable for me to see some of these things. I felt very uncomfortable when the king was potentially going to marry the 12-year-old from the Valyrian bloodline. Like, I was like, no, that's just nasty and gross. And I was very happy when he ended up going against that. Granted, Alicent was also very young, but it was like he was damn near with a baby there. I was disgusted. So that was strike one for me. Then strike two, I was like, oh my god, this show, like, Game of Thrones had some nasty shit. Like, hands down, bar none, the Cersei and Jaime stuff was disgusting. But I could throw the argument at least, like, yo, dog, they were like 40-something-year-old people. Like, they want to be nasty and gross and do that type of shit, brother and sister shit. Like, whatever, they're nasty, gross 40-something-year-olds. Dog, the stuff with Daemon and Rhaenyra really was disgusting, but in particular, you could clearly see it's Daemon. This is all Daemon's sick and twisted shit, because pretty much once he realized Viserys wasn't giving him the throne, it was basically going to Rhaenyra, he started to concoct the idea and even seduce Rhaenyra. Again, Daemon is the king's brother. Rhaenyra is the king's daughter. Do the math. And essentially manipulates her because he understands that she's wide-eyed and wants to see the world and travel the world, and brings her down to a brothel, and ultimately ensues into some nastiness. I think there was somewhere in Daemon that he recognized this is wrong and disgusting, and that's why he cut her off. But regardless of what, I gotta say that there was a couple of things, like I just mentioned, that made me feel really uncomfortable watching this show. I was watching it like, god damn, Game of Thrones has some nasty shit, bro. Really nasty shit, but what are we doing here, fam? So that's some of the horrible things about the show. I can't deny it. It isn't, you know, consistently and frequently, but it's in there, and then after a certain point, it kind of gets a little bit more nastier with Rhaenyra and Daemon, but hey, there's dragons. Because the show definitely spares no expense, and I'd imagine it might be cheaper nowadays, opposed to when they were making Game of Thrones, to use dragons and CGI and stuff like that, because the show has dragons all through and through. Of course, this is the Targaryen Empire. The Targaryens, they utilized dragons. That was their special motif. Of course, you've seen it with Daenerys, that pretty much dragons was their thing. And it's kind of funny that in the beginning of Game of Thrones, dragons have been so much so diminished that a lot of people think of it's a farce, you know, it's just a legend. Dragons don't even exist, where in House of the Dragon, they're very much so alive and real, and a lot of people use them for battle. I guess another thing that it kind of bothered me, and there's no way around it, because you're going through time skips, right? Like, you're starting off where King Viserys is, you know, normal, healthy, whatnot, and Rhaenyra's a little girl, and by the end of it, Rhaenyra's like in her late 20s, I want to say, or something like that. So there's no way out of this, but some of the constant switching of the actors and actresses, like Aegon, for example, Alicent's son, I think there was like 3 different actors in season 1 that played Aegon. And again, granted, you have to have, you know, a little child, a 4-year-old play him, but then there was like a, what I felt, unnecessary actor switch between the second and third actors, where they were damn near, they looked the same freaking age almost, and I was like, well, what was the reason to change them? I get it, one is supposed to be like 20 something years old and the other one was like teenager, but they damn near looked the same to me. So I was like, sheesh, we're doing a lot of actor changes. And again, it's time skips, people are growing up, but some of them felt unneeded. Like, I think the last couple of time skips, Alicent's actress stayed the same. There was only like one switch for Alicent. Now let's talk about the one character that is very much so alive, and well, not well, but alive during Game of Thrones. Aemon Targaryen, although throughout most of Game of Thrones he doesn't go by that name. He's the only character from House of the Dragon that is still alive during Game of Thrones, and it's kind of crazy because he knows all of this about dragons and everything, and everyone around him thinks like, yo, that shit don't even exist in the beginning of Game of Thrones. So it's kind of interesting to get his perspective, but nevertheless, he is a badass, dog. From the time he loses his eye and he has the scar, the way he's wielding that giant dragon and shit like that, he is epic, and one of my favorite characters of the show so far, because he always has that smirk like he's ready to just tear into somebody. He's a great warrior, and it really makes me wonder, considering I'm not a book reader, how the hell he gets sent to the wall as a maester for the rest of his life. Like, how does that happen? Because dude clearly loved war, clearly wanted to be king. If it was up to him, it wouldn't have been Aegon on the throne, it would have been him. So how do you go from that to getting sent to the wall? My theories is either because of what happened in season 1, him basically murdering a relative, and once his side falls, he's going to get sent to the wall, because I'm still a little bit unclear on which side wins, considering there's an Aegon on each side, and then there's a legendary Aegon. Like, I'm not exactly sure who wins to ultimately lead through to the end. I'm going to imagine that it was the other side, considering, again, Aemon gets sent to the wall, unless he voluntarily goes to the wall. I can't really recall the details, but he's dope. And Daemon would have been a real true badass that I would have been like, yeah, because of the way he invaded that one war when he was waiting for the Valerians and they didn't show up, and he just went straight through to those crab-eating zombie weirdo dudes or whatever. He was a badass and a half, but all the other nasty shit of basically seducing Rhaenyra when she was a kid and all this other, I ain't gonna lie, Daemon is just a creep to me. Flat out a creep. He's doing it all for his own gain in the end, because he wants to get the throne. I'd imagine part of his plan is, if I have Rhaenyra and Rhaenyra dies, who becomes king now? Me! But it's just disgusting and weird, and that's why I can't really rock with Daemon too strong. strong. And seeing the rivalry build up as the series comes along between Alicent and her house and Rhaenyra and her family is definitely very intriguing. I feel like a lot of it is of course due to, again, Viserys the king not being able to basically pick a side. Essentially, he wanted so much so for everybody to love and be kind with one another, which, don't get me wrong, that is a very good ruler, but because of the nature of the situation, he probably should have put his foot down, and he tried, but even in the end, basically Alicent heard what was a mix-up, so to speak. He thought he was talking to Rhaenyra about the whole legend of Aegon, and she took it as, on his last dying breath, he wanted Aegon. No, dummy, he thought he was talking to his daughter and telling his daughter to be the ruler and help to fulfill that dream that Aegon the Conqueror had all those years ago, stupid. And I also think that season 1, pretty much the closest thing we have to a villain is Daemon. And even at times, Daemon is kind of off screen, and he's, you know, he eventually gets his own family, even though he really doesn't care for them, you can tell, whatnot. But he's pretty much the closest thing we have to a villain, because you can't really villainize Alicent. At the end of the day, she didn't want to be the queen and none of that stuff. It was her father manipulating her, and even when things were starting to get real, she still wanted to save Rhaenyra and her family. And even Rhaenyra, like, yeah, she's a rambunctious and a little dirty child when she was younger, but she was manipulated by Daemon, and at the end of the day, she just wanted to enjoy life, so to speak. And I'm not speaking on the Daemon shit, I'm talking about like going on adventures, and she didn't want to be a lady, so to speak, and she's just fighting for her birthright, for what her father set forth of, no, you're supposed to be queen of, you know, the 7 kingdoms and stuff like that. So I wouldn't say either of them are villains per se. Their kids are a bunch of shitheads that clearly started a lot of stuff up, especially what happened with Aemond, and yeah, I'm trying to be as spoiler-free as I can. And so in comparing it to Game of Thrones Season 1, because realistically, hey, this is a prequel spin-off, and at the same time it's in the same universe, George R. Martin stuff, I would definitely say it's not as strong as Game of Thrones Season 1. Game of Thrones Season 1 felt like, holy shit, you know, the gauntlet's been dropped and all of this other stuff. And this one, it kind of slowly peels away at getting to the situation at hand, because you got all these years of Viserys the king still holding things from completely going batshit crazy, while I think it was towards the end of season 1, but nevertheless, when Robert dropped dead, the Lannisters went hog wild crazy, and we see what happened to Ned, you know what I'm saying, Stark. So pretty much I would say that Game of Thrones Season 1 slightly better, also less egregious things. Again, what the fuck, the Valerians, what y'all was trying to sell off, y'all, I get it, that time period, but ugh. However, the action so far is really good, and overall this first season, it felt like it was a major setup with some interesting concepts, interesting ideas, and exploring even further this grandiose world that was created by George R. Martin. And I'm curious what you guys think so far in comparison to Game of Thrones. How did you feel about Season 1 House of the Dragon? Favorite characters? And do you think that moving forward, considering George R. Martin said this should be about like 4 seasons or so, do you think that little by little as it continues, it could surpass Game of Thrones? I mean, first 4 seasons of Game of Thrones is extremely hard to outdo, but we'll see. And either way, as it stands alone, minus some of that nasty stuff, House of the Dragon is pretty dope. That's all I have for this one. I'm ForneverWorld, and as always, people, have an awesome day. Subscribe and hit that bell to get more notifications on my videos.